Today's lesson is one that I find that we sometimes pass by in the Bible when we read it. So if you looked at Mark and Matthew and Luke that I've got written on the board, you'll find that it's just one verse, each one of them. So you pick one verse and you say, well, what did all that mean? So we're going to start out with something a little different. A few years ago, there was a Mensa meeting, convention in San Francisco. Now, some of you are saying, what does Mensa mean? Well, Mensa is an organization that the word itself means table in Latin, and is reminiscent of the Latin words for mind and month, suggesting that the monthly meeting of great minds at a table. So that's what was going on. Mensa, of course, is an organization whose members have an IQ of 140 or higher. So, now some of you will know this, but 85 to 114 is average intelligence. 115 to 129 is above average intelligence. 130 to 144 is moderately gifted, and 145 to 159 is highly gifted. Now, the scale actually goes to 200, and there are people who actually have recorded 200, and some even exceptions that are 200 with a plus. So these people were having this convention in San Francisco. And so they were dining at a little cafe, some of them, and they discovered at the cafe that the salt shaker on the table contained pepper, and the pepper shaker on the table contained salt. They thought that was a stunning revelation, and they were going to study how they could refigure the situation. And they put it on themselves to only use what's on the table to reconfigure the salt and pepper. So on the table, they came up with a straw, a napkin, and a plate. And their minds were working really hard. The group debated and presented ideas, and that's what they come up with. So they called the waitress who had waited on them yet over the table. And they were going to tell her of this brilliant solution that they had to a problem. So they said to the waitress, we couldn't help but notice that the pepper shaker contains salt, and the salt shaker contains pepper. Oh, said the waitress, when they finally got her attention. Sorry about that. And without further comment, she unscrewed the tops on both the shakers and switched the caps, and then said, will that be one check or two? I guess the Mensa members learned something about the worth of common sense that day from a cafe waitress. So let's talk a little bit about salt shakers. Jesus described his followers as salt of the earth. In Matthew 5:13, as part of the Sermon on the Mount, you are the salt of the earth, he said, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. In Matthew's gospel, These words follow the Beatitudes and are often interpreted as referring to Jesus' expectations of his disciples. Now, Mark uses the same imagery. In Mark 9:50, it says, salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can you make it salty again? Bible scholar William Barclay interpreted Jesus' words like this: when a thing loses its essential quality and fails to perform its essential duty, it is fit for nothing but to be thrown away. In those days, back when Mark and Matthew and Luke were writing this, salt was a really valuable commodity. Salt was valuable for two reasons: as a preservative for food and to enhance the flavor of food. In 1853, George Crumb, a chef in New York, accidentally invented a popular dish or product. An annoying patron kept sending his French fried potatoes back to the kitchen because they were soggy. In an attempt to teach the customer a lesson, Crumb sliced the fries extra thin, fried them to crisp, and drowned them in salt. To his surprise, the complaining customer actually liked the converted fries, and thus we had the potato chip. It was born. What would potato chips taste like without salt? Or how about French fries? Or how about popcorn? Obviously, we can overindulge in salt, but few people voluntarily go on a completely salt-free diet. When Christ said that we are the salt of the earth, perhaps he was saying that we should bring flavor to life as he brought flavor to life. Years ago, a woman named Marge wrote columnist Ann Landers. Boy, that was years ago. And she had a complaint. She said, I'm 44 years old. My husband's the same age. We get along okay. He has a good job and our home's paid for. Our children are healthy and normal and we do well in school, and the three older ones who are teenagers have never caused us any trouble. So why am I writing you, Ann? Because my life is blah. Something's missing. It's like a stew without salt. I feel a certain emptiness. Can anybody identify with her complaint? Many people in our society have that emptiness within their lives. Like this woman, their lives are blah. Something is missing. And as this woman described her life, it's like stew without salt. How do we bring flavor to people's lives? We do it by showing them genuine concern. We let them know that somebody cares about them. One Saturday in a small town in Michigan, there was a 5K race. The race featured different age classes of runners. A 9-year-old boy in the race named Bowden was showing signs of fatigue as they were running the race. Behind him was a 19-year-old Marine, Lance Corporal Miles Kerr. He noticed Bowden was struggling. Miles offered some encouragement. Bowden looked up at Miles and asked, "Sir, would you please run with me?" As you know, Marines don't leave their fallen buddies behind, even if they're only 9-year-olds, and even if the Marine is carrying a full backpack. It took about 36 minutes for Bowden and Kyle to run the 5K race together. Their story was carried on Facebook under seal of honor, which added these words: by his unwavering commitment to help those in need, through his ability to inspire others by his unequivocal level of motivation, Lance Corporal Miles Kerr reflected great credit upon himself and was keeping in the highest traditions of the United States Marine Corps. You would like to think followers of Jesus Christ would be as kind and as helpful to anyone who was struggling as that Marine was. Anytime we show genuine concern for someone, we're making this world a better place. We are adding flavor to their lives. We are showing ourselves to be the salt of the earth. A woman named Martha, who was fortunate enough to run into a group of women who would most certainly qualify as the salt of the earth. Martha is a 26-year-old woman with ALS, sometimes referred to as Lou Gehrig's disease. Martha needed help. When this group of women from Evanston, Illinois, heard about Martha, they jumped into action. They began giving Martha round-the-clock nursing care. They bathed her, they fed her, they prayed for her, they witnessed to her. Martha, who had not received Christ as her Savior, couldn't understand how a loving God could let her get ALS. But when she saw God's love in these women, eventually she became a follower of Jesus. Don't you imagine that there was rejoicing in heaven when that happened?
It's not on there, but that's okay.
These women jumped into action to help this lady.
You can hear him.
Jesus said to his followers that they were salt of the earth. It was high compliment. We are to bring flavor to the lives of everyone around us by our genuine concern for others. That's the first thing that salt does.
He moved.
Salt brings flavor to food. Traditionally, however, salt played an even more important role in the lives of human beings. For many generations, it was the only real preservative humanity had for food. Indeed, before the modern miracle of refrigeration, people were quite limited in the foods they could enjoy because they were limited in preserving the food, especially meat, after it didn't last long. Think about that for a minute. How many leftovers were thrown away? Sometimes you ladies cook with a good meal, and then there's leftovers, and you eat on them for about 3 more meals, or a meal and a half, or a few things added in. But without refrigeration, you couldn't do that. So you had to use salt as a preservative.
Yep.
In his book, Salt of Society, this author by the name of W. Philip Keller recounts many of his experiences as a youngster growing up in East Africa. His parents were missionaries over there, so he grew up in Kenya. And this was on the equator and really tropical conditions. There was no refrigeration available to them for his first 18 years on this earth. As a result, his family had no way of preserving meat, fish, fruit, or vegetables. So like many generations before them, they used salt to preserve their food. Meat in particular would rapidly decay under the hot weather conditions of the equator, and salt was the only ingredient that could slow such a process. Keller recalls how tons and tons of beef, lamb, wild game meat were cut up into slender strips of flesh that were soaked in salt solution. Then those strips would be hung out to dry in the fierce sunlight, becoming what we in North America now know as jerky. Keller never took anything but jerky with him on his hunting trips. And he got nourishment from those. Salt both preserved the food in the intense heat and gave him great strength when it was consumed. That's always been so. Salt was so valuable that the soldiers of the Roman Empire received an allowance of salt as part of their pay. The origin of the English word salary comes from that. In various eras of people in Ethiopia and other parts of Africa have used salt cakes to pay their debts. Salt has been considered very valuable even in our land, all the way to current time. Now, there's a story about a king who had 3 daughters, little daughters. And he asked them, he said, "How much do you love me?" And the first daughter said, "More than all gold in the world." Second daughter said, "More than all the silver in the world." Third daughter said, "Well, more than all the salt in the world." King was not pleased with third daughter's response. However, the chef, King's cook, heard this story. And so when he fixed the meal for the king that night, he left all the salt out. King realized how valuable a commodity his daughter had recognized her love for him. During the Civil War, General Sherman of the Union Army charged one of his captains with aiding the enemy for letting the rebels acquire salt. Without salt, they cannot make bacon and salt beef, Sherman said. He said, "You can't give them that. That's contraband." Sherman insisted because of its use in curing meats, without which armies cannot subsist. Salt was very important. We simply cannot overemphasize how important salt was to earlier societies, including our own. The question is, how do we as followers of Christ serve as a preservative in our time? Here's one answer. Are we not those who have been entrusted with the task of preserving the future generations the good news of Jesus Christ? Isn't that the essential task of people of Christ, to be a witness to his presence in this world? You see, salt penetrates meat like leaven penetrates bread, or like light penetrates darkness. We are called to penetrate the world, at least the circle of influence in which we live. If we do not, of what value are we? Frank Sozinski was a postman in Louisville, Kentucky, who didn't want to deliver some of his mail. Over a 6-year period, he stashed away tons of it in 1,200 bags in his basement. When the mail was finally discovered, Frank was charged with delaying mail intended for delivery. A mail carrier's job is to see the mail gets through. What good is a mailman who doesn't deliver the mail? What good is salt if it doesn't season? What good is a Christian who keeps his Christianity within the safe confines of his church or her home or his home, and it never gets out? What good is that? Most of us have read Rudyard Kipling's famous poem, Mulholland's Vow. Mulholland had a job handling cattle on a large ship. One night out at sea, a storm broke out and knocked the ship all over the place, and the cows were on the deck and they were moving around, and Mulholland feared for his life, and he made a bargain with God, and he said, if you let me get out of here without getting stuck with these horns or without trampled underneath these cows, I promise that I will serve you from now on. Well, God kept his part of the deal. And when Mulholland got safely to land, he began to do his part of the deal, to serve God by preaching in a land where nobody knew him. God had other plans for him. He commanded the sailor, back you go to the cattle boats to preach my gospel there. Mulholland's witness was to those he knew and who knew him. We have a circle of influence, and we should work that circle of influence and be a witness to it. What Jesus wants are witnesses, people who will witness to this generation that Christ is alive and at work in the world. People who will testify to the difference his presence has made in their lives. People who, because of their credibility, will make it possible to preserve the teachings of Christ for later generations. We each need to ask the question whether our lives would convince people that Christ is alive by the difference that they see he's made in our lives. Are we a witness for the Lord? A man named Jeffrey Collins tells this story. It had been a trying week for Jeffrey in his organization and the work he does. See, Jeffrey belongs to an organization called Love and Action. And this organization is based in Maryland. And basically, they focus on AIDS patients. These AIDS patients, they go see, they visit, they help, they do all these things. It's very active. Well, Jeffrey had a 60-hour work week. He was whipped. And he was looking forward to having a quiet dinner with his friends. Then the phone rang. Jeff, it's Jimmy, he heard the quivering voice say. Jimmy, who suffered from several AIDS-related illnesses, was one of his regular clients. Jimmy said, I'm really sick, Jeff. I've got a fever. Please help me. Though he tried not to show it, this angered Jeffrey. After a 60-hour work week, he didn't want to hear about Jimmy. Even people whose lives are devoted to doing good can sometimes suffer from what has been called compassion fatigue. But Jeff promised to be right over. Still, the drive over there, he complained to God about the inconvenience. He said the moment he walked in the door, he could smell the vomit. Jimmy was on the sofa, shivering and in distress. Jeffrey wiped his forehead, then got a bucket of soapy water to clean up the mess. He managed to maintain a facade of concern, even though he was still mad about having to miss out on his plan. Jimmy's friend Russ, who also had AIDS, came downstairs. The odor from the vomit made Russ sick too. As he cleaned the carpet around Russ's chair, Jeffrey said he was ready to explode. Here he was cleaning up after two men, not just one. Then suddenly, Russ startled him when he said, I understand. He blurted it out. I understand. Jimmy asked weakly, you understand what, Russ? I understand who Jesus is, Russ said through his tears. He's like Jeff. Suddenly, Jeffrey began to weep. He hugged Russ, prayed for him, and that night, Russ, as well as Jimmy, decided to follow the Lord. Several years ago, there was a very popular Christian book came out, and it was titled Out of the Salt Shaker and Into the World. And it was subtitled Evangelism as a Way of Life. The author was Rebecca Manley Pippert, a global conference speaker, evangelist, author. She also wrote the book Also Stay Salt. Salt is good, Jesus said, but if it loses its saltiness, how can you make it salty again? Rebecca's thesis was salt is good, but if salt stays in the shaker, what good is it? How can it flavor life if it stays in the salt shaker? How can it preserve food if it stays in the shaker? How do we get the salt that will change our world out of the shaker? Really, there's only one way, and that is for followers of Jesus to live as Christ lived, showing his love for all the world to see. You are the salt of the earth, Jesus said. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? There's only one way for that to happen as well. That is by each of us drawing closer to him so that his love will radiate through us. Jesus said, you are the salt of the world. I'm sure many of you have heard that said about people. I don't think the younger people use those terms anymore, but being salt of the earth means that you've done something that made someone feel that flavor. That's God's call for most of us, to be salt where we are, with a higher standard for living, not a higher standard of living. It's nice if you can afford a high standard of living, but a higher standard for living is much more important. Even better is a high standard for loving. Then we will not have to worry that the salt will never get out of the shaker. You can be that flavor to someone's life. And in doing that, you will bring flavor to your own. And all God's people said,